Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nigel Smith. Really appreciate you all coming out to spend your afternoon inside on a absolutely beautiful afternoon. Thrilled to be part of this inaugural Hackney History Festival. I've called my talk Gainsborough Studios, or Hackney's Little Hollywood. And I've been obsessed with film since I was very, very young. This is my first ever cinema ticket to see Superman 2 when I was 4 years old. Today, among other things, one way that I sort of explore my interest in film is leading walking tours about the history of cinemas and cinema going in London. Here I am in front of the Odeon Leicester Square with a group recently. So I love cinema, I love walking, I love exploring places where London's film history is often hiding in plain sight, which is how I became interested in the old Gainsborough Studios. So, does everybody know who this is? I assume probably do. Alfred Hitchcock, yeah. So he looms large over this talk. You know, arguably one of the most recognisable and successful film directors of all time. Any favourite Hitchcock films among people here? Yes? Vertigo. Any others? Rear Window. So Vertigo, Rear Window. So these films, most of these films, sorry, we're going to spoiler alert. So most of these films, you know, Vertigo, Psycho, Rear Window, Hollywood films, and these are the films that Hitchcock is most known for today, but he was born here in London, started his career here, which explains why there is a massive sculpture of his head a few yards from the Regent's Canal. So this sculpture is in the courtyard of what's now a block of flats, 250 flats, called Gainsborough Studios, and they opened in 2004. So from where we are right now at the Museum of the Home, it's about a 20-minute walk. So you go through Shoreditch Park, then you'll see another film-related sculpture. This one is called Hitchcock's Eye. It resembles a reel of film. Walk through the park, cross Pool Street, and then you'll get to the main entrance of the flats. Through the gates, and you'll be in the courtyard where that big sculpture is. And then if you wander through, you'll be at the Regent's Canal. So a very nice view for people who live in the flats this side. Just out of interest, does anybody here who actually lives in these block of flats? Or has done? No. Yes, interesting. We'll maybe talk about that in the Q&A afterwards. So where this block of flats was once the site of one of the most technically advanced film studios in the country. And between 1920 and 1949, more than 170 films were made here. For the majority of the building's life as a film studio, it was home to Gainsborough Pictures, one of the major British film producers up to the 1950s. So some of you may recognise their logo. Since we're at a history festival, I felt compelled to tell you this logo is inspired by a portrait by Thomas Gainsborough, the great 18th century painter. This is a Gainsborough painting, Mrs. Siddons. Sarah Siddons was the best known tragedian of the 18th century, so a very famous actress, appropriate inspiration for a film company. So over the next sort of 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you the story of the film studios, how the likes of Ivor Novello, James Mason, Margaret Lockwood, how they made it famous. We're also going to briefly look at what happened to the studios after they closed, and at the end, hopefully we should have time for a few questions, if you have any. So, our story begins more than 100 years ago, just after the end of World War I. The building that became the studios was originally a Victorian power station, hence the huge chimney that you can see in this photo. During World War I, this building was used as a factory to make tents, tarpaulins for the World War I war effort. After the war, it's dirty, dilapidated, and that's when people thought this could be an opportunity to put a film studio here. But the people who built that studio and made that investment were not locals. They were, in fact, Americans. And the famous Players Lasky Corporation, this is one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. It's the company that became Paramount Pictures, that you've probably all heard of. So they plan to break into the UK film market. Going to want to do sort of produce films sort of in this country that would appeal to British audience, but also that they could market to Americans. And they named the studio Islington Studios. By 1920, they'd done all the work. It was ready to open. So as you can see, it was huge. That's the chimney sort of disappearing at the end there. So Jesse Lasky, who's the founder of Paramount Pictures, he wrote in his memoirs, we picked a location for the Islington Studios where heavy fog could collect, even when the rest of London was in bright sunshine. Some of the artistic soft focus photography so admired by critics in this country was simply fog that eluded the fans. So it had two large studio spaces as well as editing rooms, all the other production facilities you might expect. So this is studio number 1 on the ground floor, and you can see it's got this sort of big concrete tank sunk into the floor. So they could fill that with water, use it for film, sea battles and such like, so pretty ingenious. It had windows on the side so they could film inside to do sort of early underwater scenes. And then this is the number 2 studio, slightly smaller, but still big enough. They can have 6 sets all in operation, all at the same time. This is the cutting room. This is where the film editors worked. And this is the art department. And this is the place that attracted the attention of the young Alfred Hitchcock. Here he is, looking quite dapper in his youth. So at the time, Hitchcock was working at an engineering company in the city called Henley's, but he loved movies. We're still in the silent era at this period. So Hitchcock wrote a letter to famous players in search of work. And he managed to get a job as a freelancer, writing and designing the title cards, so the cards on silent films explaining what's happening, in between the scenes. By 1921, he's got a full-time job at the studio. And in the Henley's newspaper, this is where he worked previously, this is what they wrote as a little send-off. He has gone into the film business, not as a film actor, as you might easily suppose, but to take charge of the art title department of one of the biggest Anglo-American producing companies. We shall miss him in many ways, but we wish him all success. So, their wish was granted. This is Hitchcock on the set of one of his early films called The Farmer's Wife. I'm just going to play you a brief audio clip of Hitchcock describing his rise up the ranks.
I was very content when I was going to get the job then as assistant director. And then they said, well, do you know of a good writer we can get? I said, I'll write it. And then my friend, who was going to be the art director of the picture, he said he couldn't come. He had another job. Said, what are we going to do for an art director? I said, I'll do the art director.
So quite the ambitious and successful young man. So Hitchcock is not the only person making films here. This is a really good example of the sort of things that the Americans thought would be a big hit. So it's called the Bonnie Briar Bush. You can see it's advertising itself as a Paramount picture. So sadly, like about 80% of all silent movies, it's lost. So we have to rely on IMDb for the plot description. A lord's son is engaged to his rich ward, but he prefers a peasant. Huge production. So the set at the studios involved building a Scottish castle. There's a big banqueting scene where they used 30 extras. A lot of those would have been local people. This is a production still from the making of the film, and I want to draw your attention to this woman who's sitting at the front here. So I showed you the cutting room earlier. This is the editor of the Bonnie Briar Bush, a woman called Alma Revell. Alma Revell was born the same year as Hitchcock, but she entered the film industry even earlier. At 16, she joined the London Film Company at the studios in Twickenham as a tea girl, and then within 2 years, so 18 years old, she's an editor and then assistant director. She started working at the Islington Studios in 1921, and this is an article just all about her. So, gives you a kind of an indication of what a prodigy she was in the burgeoning film industry. And it reads, little Alma Revell is nothing like as unsophisticated as she looks, as some tough film guys have discovered to their cost. A glance at her past career explains why she day to day occupies so unique a position in European films. So for a while at least, at the Islington Studios, she had much more experience and responsibility than Alfred Hitchcock. That, however, was about to change. So in 1923, by this time, Famous Players, the American company, had made about a dozen films at Islington, but none had been particularly successful. So they leased out the studios to British productions. And this is one of them, 1923, Woman to Woman. It was made by a fledgling partnership of the film producer Michael Balcon and film director called Graham Cutts. And this is a still from the film. So the actor is a guy called Clive Brooke. He plays a character called David Compton, English officer billeted in Paris who woos a cabaret dancer played by an American star called Betty Compson. So productions renting the facilities at the studios got access to all of the in-house talent, and that included the young and ambitious Alfred Hitchcock. So Alfred Hitchcock calls Alma Revell, "Is that Miss Revell? This is Alfred Hitchcock. I've been appointed assistant director for a new film. I wonder if you would accept a position as cutter on the picture." So Alma's recollection of this first encounter kind of sums up 1920s sexual politics quite well. So she recalls, "Since it is unthinkable for a British male to admit that a woman has a job more important than his, Hitch had waited to speak to me until he had a higher position." By 1927, Alfred Hitchcock and Alma Revell are married. Alma Revell collaborated on every single Hitchcock production subsequently for the rest of his career. Sadly, Woman to Woman is another lost film, but we do know it was a huge hit and helped build the credibility of the fledgling British film industry. One reviewer wrote, "Woman to Woman does one important thing astonishingly well. It forever blasts the delusion that a production technically perfect cannot come out of a British studio." So 1924, by hiring American stars attempting to match Hollywood's production values, Michael Balcon and Graham Cutts thought they could sort of beat the Americans at their own game. So to do so, in 1924, they founded a new company, Gainsborough Pictures. So again, using studios at Islington, the first film Gainsborough Studios released was called The Passionate Adventure. So this is the one-line plot description. "Stuck in a marriage without children or passion, Adrian seeks adventure in London's East End." So Hitchcock wrote the script. It was adapted from a novel by a guy called Frank Staton. And again, they cast the lead from Woman to Woman, Clive Brooke, and another female star, Alice Joyce. That's who you can see here. And this is the American poster for the film. So you can think they managed to distribute the film overseas. Gainsborough had another hit the following year when Balcon signed a contract with one of the most significant figures in 1920s entertainment, Ivor Novello. So here he is with Balcon, publicity photo, kind of signing his contract. So not only was Novello an actor, he also sang, wrote plays, composed music, came to fame during World War I. He wrote the song "Keep the Home Fires Burning." He wrote that as a teenager, and that was a huge hit in World War I. So Novello had a play called The Rat, set in the Parisian underworld. It had been a big hit on stage in both New York and London in 1924, so Michael Balcon thought it was ripe for screen adaptation. So in 1925, they produced the film at Islington with yet another American actress called Mae Marsh. And just to give you an impression of what a star she was, she got the boat from New York to Southampton and then got the train. And when her train arrived at Waterloo, tens of thousands of British fans of her work were there to greet her. It's quite a salacious film at the time. Ivor Novello plays the Rat. He's a jewel thief. He's got his headquarters at a nightclub. So I'm just going to show you a brief clip set in the club. It's kind of a lot more exciting than maybe the sort of like genteel sort of English parlours you might expect from a film of this era. You wait. Oh yeah. So unexpected, I mean not unexpectedly, entirely expectedly, huge hit. Ivor Novello becomes a movie star. Gainsborough actually produced 2 sequels. So if you think kind of like making sequels and using IP as a new thing, not at all. The Triumph of the Rat in 1926, Return of the Rat in 1929. So famous players, the Americans, hadn't produced any of their own films at Islington Studios since 1922. But Gainsborough, they were not the only British company making films there. This is another significant film released in 1926. Nell Gwynn starred one of the icons of American cinema, Dorothy Gish, playing Charles II's mistress, directed by Herbert Wilcox for a company called British National Pictures. And if you've never heard of Dorothy Gish, like Broadway and Hollywood legend, along with her older sister Lillian, kind of among the very biggest stars of the silent era. So while some British productions were selling well in America, famous players Lasky was having second thoughts about its investment in the studios. February 1926, Lasky's man in London, a guy called J.C. Graham, announced that no more Paramount pictures would be made in Islington. In his words, the productions had failed to reach a quality comparable with those made in America, and hence the determination not to proceed here. He did point out also in his statement that all of his investors had received full return on their investment with an interest rate of 6%. So it wasn't all bad news. But this kind of presented an opportunity for Michael Balcon's Gainsborough Pictures. So knowing Lasky had itchy feet, Balcon recalls what happened next in his memoir. It's a book called A Lifetime in Films. So he went to meet J.C. Graham, managing director of Paramount, along with a young man from his accounts office called Reginald Baker. The meeting is clear in my memory, and I believe I can reproduce the essential part of the conversation verbatim, he wrote. It went like this. Graham: yes, I'm willing to sell the studios. I want £100,000. Baker: we have a surprise for you, Mr. Graham. We can only raise £14,000. Graham: I have a bigger surprise for you. I'm going to accept your offer. Baker: today is full of surprises, Mr. Graham. We shall have to spread our payments, £2,000 a year for 7 years. Graham accepted our terms. It was a day to remember. And it was in partnership with Reg Baker, this is Balcon writing, that I ran Ealing Studios for 20 years. So it was a fortuitous meeting for numerous occasions. So Michael Balcon's success with Gainsborough Pictures at Islington made him one of the most influential people in the British film industry. 1927, a rival studio, British Gaumont, they made films at their Lime Grove studios in Shepherd's Bush, approached Balcon to work with them. And Gainsborough and British Gaumont became sister companies with Michael Balcon head of production of both. And there was a growing need for British productions because of a piece of legislation, this piece of legislation, the Cinematograph Films Act of 1927. So then, as now, British audience kind of favoured American films over anything else. So lobbying from the struggling British film industry led to the passing of this act into law in 1928. And one of the things that this act did was legally enforce the fact that distributors and exhibitors were then required to show a proportion of British films. Starting in 1928, 7.5% of all films had to be British, and then by 1936, 20%. So it did increase British production. In 1926, 37 British features shown in the UK cinemas. That rose to 45 in 1927, and by 1928, there are 72. The downside of this is a lot of these quite low quality, low budget B movies made basically to fill the programme. And you might have heard of a term called quota quickies. That's what these films were. a lot of them. One film, though, definitely not quote a quickie, made in 1927, is this one, The Lodger, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Ivor Novello. It's about a mysterious young man who takes up residence at a London boarding house just as a killer known as the Avenger descends upon the city, preying on blonde women. So these are tropes, if you know your Hitchcock, he would return to regularly throughout his career. And The Lodger is often referred to as the first true Hitchcock film. And also pretty innovative for the time. It's not lost, thank goodness. I can show you a clip. So for this shot that I'm going to show you, Hitchcock got Ivor Novello, the film star, to walk across a plate of glass. So it looks like he's suspended in the studio and then shot from below. So you can see why Hitchcock became known as the Master of Suspense. 1929, the next great innovation for Hitchcock was sound. And in 1929, he directed the first British talkie, Blackmail. He didn't make Blackmail at the studios, Islington Studios. He shot it at Boreham Wood. But I just wanted to show you this photo, just so you can see kind of like the technical challenges of making early talkies. So Hitchcock is here with the headphones on, with his actress Annie Andra, and the camera is in this sort of soundproof box. Michael Balcon, head of Gainsborough Studios, kind of admitted that, like many British producers, he'd initially missed a trick when it came to sound. This is what he wrote in his memoir again. Frankly, we were all caught on the hop, and I'm afraid slow on the uptake as well. It is hard to believe now that there were people who thought this novelty of talking films would never oust the silent film. So at first, Gainsborough adapted silent films and they added sound effects and a little bit of dialogue. Balcon also went into partnership with a German studio to co-produce films in Islington where dialogue would be recorded in English and in German. So he basically could create talkies for both markets simultaneously. This was the first one that they did. It's called A Second Kiss. I don't know if you can see on the poster, it says, synchronized and part talkie. So at this point, I just want to have a little pause for a moment just to preempt a question that I suspect some of you may have, and it may well have been driving you a little bit bananas. So we're here at the Hackney History Festival, and I keep referring to the Islington Studios. So your frustration about this would not be unique. In my research, I found a great letter to the Daily Mirror. This is what it says. W.H. Girling Jr. of Newton Street writes, as the Gainsborough Studios are situated in Poole Street, Hoxton, N1, why does your great daily, in company with other contemporary periodicals, continually refer the studios, Gainsborough Studios, Islington? Am I to regard this as a colossal ignorance or snobbery, or both? The Mirror replies, both, Mr. Girling, both. But who cares? Now, for the whole lifetime of the studios, they actually weren't technically in Hackney either. So Poole Street was always been in the borough of Shoreditch until 1965. And that's when Hackney, Shoreditch merged and Stoke Newington merged to make the new Hackney that we're in today. But the truth is, the studios are literally a stone's throw from Islington. And I suspect there sort of is a mixture of, snobbery, general name recognition as to why the original American owners called it Islington. And it was referred to sort of as such, until they closed in 1929. So we can get into the semantics in the Q&A if you really want to, but I'm going to continue in that tradition, I'm afraid, and use Gainsborough and Islington interchangeably for the rest of the talk. So let's get back to the 1930s, another pivotal incident in the studio's history. So by 1930, the studios have been equipped at great expense for sound production, but sadly, in January 1930, disaster struck. While shooting a film set during the Crimean War, it's called Balaclava, the studios caught fire. of some melted wax. It kind of ignited on the wooden sets, very flammable, and engulfed the whole studios. One person died in the fire, and they closed productions for almost a year at the studio. They completed the film at the studios in Shepherd's Bush. Fast forward to 1936, Michael Balcon left Gainsborough, this company that he founded. He, for 2 years, worked for MGM British, the American studios, had a pretty miserable time there, and that's after when he accepted the invitation of his old friend Reg Baker to set up Islington studio. Islington. Oh, I've pressed something wrong. Sorry. Are we back? Yes. Okay. Ooh. Sorry. There we go. So yeah. So new ownership at the studio. So for the rest of the or new people running it, still Gainsborough Studios. So for the rest of the 1930s and most of the 40s, production at Gainsborough was led by two men. These guys, Ted Black and Maurice Ostra. So rather than sort of like look to make movies that were going to be successful in America, like Balcon did, Black in particular was very much sort of kind of in tune to kind of mainstream British taste at the time. In the 1930s, Gainsborough became home to one of the biggest stars at the UK box office. This chap, Will Hay, been a successful stage comic, kind of perfected this character of this sort of put-upon schoolmaster. This is from his first film that he made there, 1935, film called Boys Will Be Boys. This is an on-set production of another similar film called Good Morning Boys. And then in 1937, made this comedy called Oh, Mr. Porter, which regularly you will see on lists as sort of like the greatest British comedy of all time. By 1938, Will Hay was the third biggest draw at the UK box office. Number one was this woman, singer and comedian Gracie Fields. She made her final film in Britain, Shipyard Sally at Gainsborough Studios. But it was Alfred Hitchcock again who ended up making the best film at Gainsborough Studios in the 1930s. If you only see one film that I talk about today, see this one. It is an absolute masterpiece. This is a great photo on set in the studio. You'll notice it takes place on a train. So this is Hitchcock next to Margaret Lockwood and Redgrave. So Lady Vanishes was a huge hit, both here in the UK and in America. It was the last film Hitchcock made at the Islington Studios. He only made one more film in Britain before moving to America, signing a 7-year contract with the Hollywood producer David O. Selznick. Alfred Hitchcock left England for Hollywood in 1939, same year that World War II broke out. So Hackney and Islington both bombed heavily during the war. The studio's chimney, this remnant of its power station, passed. Amazingly, at the time, this was the third tallest building in London. So prime target. Had it been bombed and collapsed, it would have, completely destroyed the whole studio complex. As it happens, the studio closed briefly, but production continued throughout the war. In 1941, ownership of the studios changed again. So the Rank organisation, J. Arthur Rank, bought Gainsborough Studios and kind of heralded a brief period of films that today I think are probably the films that are most fondly remembered and most associated with Gainsborough Studios. If you hear the name Gainsborough Studios, these sort of like bodice-ripping melodramas, often starring sexy Jane Mason opposite the lovely Margaret Lockwood. 1943, this is one of the most famous, The Man in Grey. So more people went to the cinema in the 1940s, in Britain and in America, any time before or since. And they wanted to see films like this, sort of escapist fantasies. They resonated with audiences, especially female audiences who experienced, unprecedented degree of financial, sexual independence during World War II. The traditional breadwinners overseas fighting, families split up, birth rate fell sharply, contraceptive use increases, casual sexual relationships flourished, and this is sort of what's reflected in these Gainsborough melodramas. My favourite of the genre is The Wicked Lady, also starring Margaret Lockwood as a nobleman's wife. She becomes a highwaywoman, and James Mason again is her roguish love interest. I think for sheer smouldering and also, what I love about it, innuendo, this is very, very hard to beat.
Now perhaps you'll tell me who gave you leave to trespass on Cherry Jackson's preserves. By my stars. Skirt we have to say.
Sherry nearly had a cough. You always take women by the throat.
No, I don't take them. So you've heard of me, eh? Well, remember, that stretch of road between Fenny Stratford and Heatherweald is sacred to the said Captain Jackson. Those who poach there do so at their peril.
I shan't forget your warning.
Good.
Though I may ignore it.
I like your spirit, my pretty lad. We're both from Land's End to John O'Groats, if you like.
Hey?
I got myself in luck tonight, I can tell you. I think still could sit back and watch while you collected the goldfinches for me.
For us.
Well, that depends. Isn't a matter that can be settled quickly or with dry clothes. I know an inn near here where the hostess is the best cook in Buckinghamshire. Will you do me the favour of supping with me?
What have I got to lose?
That is a conjecture.
Watch it, terrific. So by 1946, J. Arthur Rank kind of wanted more direct control of the studio. Many of the old-timers left. And he appointed a guy called Sidney Box to run Gainsborough Studios. He'd had a huge hit with another studio earlier, another James Mason film, melodrama called The Seventh Veil. So this is Sidney Box looking towards his wife Muriel on your left, and then looking on from the other side is his sister Betty. So Sidney Box didn't really care too much for the films that had been made, these melodramas that made kind of Gainsborough famous. So the subsequent films kind of either veer to sort of like more light-hearted fare or actually an element of social realism. One kind of nepotistic upside of Sidney Box's appointment is he gave more influence both to Muriel, who had co-written The Seventh Veil, and Betty. Betty Box became head of production at Islington. From late 1946 right throughout the 1950s, Betty Box was the only major female producer in the British film industry, and in the last 2 years of Islington Studios produced 10 films. This is my favourite Betty Box production made at Gainsborough Studio, Miranda, with the recently deceased Glynis Johns as a seductive mermaid. Here she is. Her tail is specially made for the film by the Dunlop Rubber Company. 1948, this is the studio's final, there we go. So 1948 is the studio's final year. That year, Betty Box would produce, and Muriel Box would co-write what would become the final Gainsborough film shot at the studio. Here Come the Huggets. It was the third film in sort of a comedy series about a working class family. Stars the young Diana Dawes as the troublesome visiting cousin. And then after 170 films have been produced there in almost 30 years, the Rank conglomerate decided to cut costs, concentrate its efforts on its studios at Denham and Pinewood. They sold the studios in Shepherd's Bush to the BBC. Sidney Box is still in charge. They had an auction to sell off 2,619 lots of studio property, not just film equipment. This is from a newspaper report. Brisk prices were bid for gas heaters, rotary converters, band instruments, baking tins, canteen knives, and a cheese dish. Before the sale ends, the auctioneer's hammer will have come down on the mermaid's tail worn by Miss Glynis Johns and Miranda. My favourite article that I found about the studio's closure is from the Toronto Star. So the Canadian newspaper's entertainment reporter had visited the studio many times over the year, and he wrote a lovely eulogy. The Gainsborough Studio was the quaintest we ever visited, and during a tour of English film factories some time ago, we developed a strange attachment for the place. Even the employees called it the Rabbit Warren because of the difficulty of finding a way around its circuitous passages and eerie staircases. Its commissary has only 3 small tables and 1 big one, providing the democratic necessity for stars, script clerks and grips to dine elbow to elbow. Somehow, out of this disreputable pile came some very fine pictures. We'll never know how it was done, but it was. And out of this fact grew a strong affection on the part of English actors and actresses for little crummy old Gainsborough in Islington. So the building was put up for sale. In 1951, Scotch whisky distillers James Buchanan and Co. bought the building for warehouse storage. It was later bought by a carpet company, Kellety, to store Oriental rugs. If you lived in the area a long time, you might remember when it still looked like this. They used it for decades, relocated to Wembley, they still are. For most of the 90s, it was semi-derelict, occasionally being used for TV productions, music videos, even a low-budget film called Anxiety, which technically is the last ever film made at the studios. And remarkably, a photographer called Bill Osman found out that I was doing this talk and sent me these pictures just last week. He was taking photographs at that time. This is another one of the photos he shared with me. So plans for redevelopment kind of started to emerge at this time in the mid-1990s. In 1996, planning permission was blocked for it to become a bingo hall, thankfully. Building got a new lease of life in the 2000s. February 2000, the fashion designer Alexander McQueen used the space to unveil his latest collection. That spring, the Almeida Theatre took over the building and did 2 Shakespeare productions starring Ralph Fiennes, Richard II, and Coriolanus. Here he is with fellow actor Linus Roach. He played Bolingbroke in Richard II. And then in December 2000, the studios kind of got back to their film roots with this event that combined visual art, live music, and screenings of Hitchcock's 39 Steps and Vertigo. And my friend Philip Ilson, who's actually sitting at the back there, he's now the co-director of the London Short Film Festival, but he was involved in putting on this event and sent me these photos. So it kind of gives you a really good idea of what this building was like back then. Here you can see the orchestra playing, the projector shining through a crack in the wall. So as the redevelopment plans moved forward, you started to see headlines like this that include quite a lot of hyperbolic quotes from the developers saying things like, "Imagine taking a slice of Covent Garden and putting it down in Shoreditch." And "We want this part of London to become a great centre for film arts again." Finally, September 2003, Hitchcock sculpture by Anthony Donaldson was unveiled by Anthony Minghella, the film director. He was also chair at the BFI back then. Following year, the flats were built. So today, that huge sculpture is one reminder of the area's filmmaking past. You can also find this plaque on the wall. I'm not going to quibble with the dates right now, but it mentions Hitchcock, Ivor Novello, Michael Balcon, Gracie Fields. Kind of personally, I think it'd be nice for more commemoration here. Might also mention Alma Revel, Dorothy Gish, Margaret Lockwood, mural in Betty Box. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. So I've got time for some questions. If you're interested, this is me doing, I'm the only person who's been here today who doesn't have a book to sell. But if you'd like to come on a walk with me, that QR code is for my mailing list and you can find out more there. And there's also some cards of mine on the Hackney History Society table at the back. But very, very happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
What happened to the grand studio gates to the studios?
Question is, what happened to the grand studio gates? The short answer is I don't know. And what's very, very disappointing, and you could do another 40-minute talk about the story of the redevelopment and how they have been redeveloped, because there was a lot of promise of retaining the heritage, and those gates were cited as one of the things that were going to be preserved, and they weren't. There was one of the other remarkable things is inside the bizarre plan for inside that sculpture there was going to be an editing suite, there's actually Alan Parker, the director. He got very some kind of great angry Alan Parker rants kind of quite a few years later, kind of reflecting on the fact that a lot of this promise about regenerating it and bringing film back never happened. So I don't know where the gates are. I would love to find out. But yeah, don't know. Yes.
Hi Nigel. It's slightly a bleak question just listening to you, but Hollywood got going, as I understand it, because the weather was great. Whereas British studios, all in places like Hackney and Ealing and Lime Grove, and any thoughts on why that was?
So the question is about, like, Hollywood studios are all in nice California. British studios are all in these sort of grimy parts of London. This is all sort of speculation. One, we don't have a California. That's a big part of it. I think, obviously, London's the obvious place just in terms of transport links, and especially in its early period, the building in the sort of suburban areas outside of London, which is where a lot of the studios are today, hadn't happened. So it's not a very satisfactory answer. But yeah, I don't really know. But we don't have nice weather like California.
We have the London smog.
We do have the London smog, and like Jesse Lasky, was saying, there is sort of something quite evocative about filming around that area, and they did definitely make use of a little bit of like local street locations, and the locals were called in to be extras quite regularly. Any other questions? Yes, at the front.
The Margaret Lockwood, the body shooting, is it true that Hollywood insisted on them being reshot because of the low economy?
Okay, question about Margaret Lockwood and whether her shots, Hollywood demanded that her shots, basically showing too much cleavage, and Hollywood were not happy about that. I don't know. It would not surprise me. And Hollywood films at the times are governed by the production code, which we didn't have the same code here. So yeah, and they were definitely being made for that international market. So it would not surprise me if British producers sort of did take into account what their Hollywood paymasters were wanted to do. Yep.
Does any part of the old building survive?
A question: does any part of the old building survive? Kind of not bits. There is sort of some brickwork and sort of exterior walls, but you definitely don't look at it and go, oh, that's that building that used to be there. Yep.
When did the chimney come down?
Oh, when did the chimney come down? I don't know the exact date. So, but I don't know. Any others?
They filmed Fanny by Gaslight here in Gainsborough. That was the Thorold Dickinson version.
Did they film Fanny by Gaslight? I don't know.
The early one was Murder in Thornton Square. The early version.
That was filmed at Gainsborough. No. Don't know that. But we can look that up afterwards very quickly. Any others? Yep, in the back.
How many people worked at the building in its pomp?
Yeah, good question. How many people worked in the building in its heyday? About 300. So it was a huge operation. And that was, most of those were sort of permanent staff, because you had all of the department, costumes happened there, all of the departments happened there, and they would be doing more than one production often at the same time. Yeah. There's a terrible, when it closed down in '48, I read an account of, Sydney Box basically came to the studio and sort of announced, basically, you've got 2 weeks, and it's 200-300 people out of work. Yes?
You mentioned about the war, where there's continued production through the war, but was it purely commercial, or did it get dragged into the propaganda war?
Yeah. So a question about the film production during World War II. Was it just commercial films, or was there kind of propaganda films there? As far as I know, most of what was filmed at the Gainsborough Studio was still kind of the commercial Gainsborough films rather than kind of war propaganda. Got time for a couple more if anybody's got a question? Yep.
I always smile when I go past the studios and see all the crows sitting on the top of the building. That was an inspiration for Hitchcock.
So the question, brilliant. So the question was, the person asked the question, they always feel quite inspired when they go past the building and they see loads and loads of crows perching on top of the studios, and was that an inspiration for Hitchcock? I think it's unlikely it was inspiration for Hitchcock because he adapted the birds from the Du Maurier short story, but it is a lovely little touchstone, and that is a nice place to end. So, yeah, thank you very much.